rolling?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for everyone for coming today. Can you hear me well? Yeah? Okay, terrific. Before we get started, I just want to mention that we're recording this event, and it will be at some point available online. So if you have any concerns of any kind, just be aware that we're being recorded. Okay, so welcome everyone. Our lecture today is part of the Yin-Cheng Distinguished Lecture Series on Buddhism, which is sponsored by the Tzu Chi Foundation. So before I introduce our speaker, we would just like to thank the Tzu Chi Foundation for its very generous support of Buddhist studies globally, which makes events like this possible. So it gives me really tremendous pleasure to welcome here today Professor Meir Shahar. Meir Shahar is currently the Shaul Eisenberg Chair for East Asian Affairs at Tel Aviv University. Professor Shahar's research spans several fields. He is not only a prominent scholar of Buddhism, but also a leading scholar of Chinese religions, literature, history, and culture. His publications are too numerous to quote here, but let me just mention his books, Crazy G, Chinese Religion and Popular Literature, Audible God, the Chinese Ninja and his Indian Origins, and the Shaolin Monastery, History, Religion, and the Chinese Martial Arts, which has been translated, by the way, into several languages. He also co-edited several edited volumes, including Unruly Gods, Divinity and Society in China, and India in the Chinese Imagination. And Professor Shahar is currently completing a book titled Kings of Oxen and Horses, Draft Animals, Buddhism, and Chinese Rural Religion. And we're very fortunate today to hear a little bit about his current research before the book is even out, so we're very privileged. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Shahar.
So thank you so much. I should say I'm a guest here. Noga invited me, and it's the greatest pleasure to be a guest at Noga. So I'm falling in love with this place thanks to her. So thank you, and thank you all for coming. I should begin, you know, always lectures begin with an apology, yes? So I also have an apology to make, which is that I believe some of you are familiar with some of what I'm going to say. Because I think that 2 years ago I was invited to give here a talk by Zoom. Don't know if you heard it. So if you heard it, well, if you haven't heard it, it's fine, because there is going to be some repetition. So I'll begin. This is how I move around. Okay. I think, I don't know, is it a common prejudice that Chinese people eat everything? I don't know, in Israel it's a common prejudice. The Chinese eat everything. Of course it's not true. There are a billion and a half Chinese and they all eat different things. But more than that, beginning in the Song period and all through the early 20th century, many Chinese, possibly the majority of the Chinese population, especially in South China, refrained from eating beef. Chinese people did not eat beef. The beef taboo, in Chinese it's Niu-jie, was widely propagated in China. It means that the Chinese didn't eat ox. You know, the ox was the draft animal in North China, where it plowed the wheat fields, the dry fields of the north. And the buffalo was the bovine draft animal in the south. Chinese people, for the most part, didn't eat either ox in the north or buffalo in the south. So the Niu-jie was widely propagated, the beef taboo was widely propagated. Here you see, for example, a painting from a temple in Taiwan, in South China, and you see a poor guy here, a poor sinner, a soul, being tormented in hell, being punished, and he's shown his crime in the karma mirror. Yes? And you can see his crime. It's the slaughter of a bovine, judging by the color, gray slate, and the backward sweeping horns. It's a buffalo, yes? So he's being punished in hell for slaughtering or eating buffalo meat. That's a late Qing painting, perhaps, or perhaps early 20th century painting. This is the same scene 1,000 years earlier in Dunhuang, a Dunhuang painting from the 10th century. You see again a person being punished in hell. He's shown his crime in the karma mirror. That's 1,000 years earlier. And again, it's the crime of bovine slaughter. He's slaughtering, in this case, it should be an ox. It's the north and the animal is white. Okay? So this beef taboo was widely propagated, and the beef taboo was related, that's one of my points, it was intimately related. You might even say that it was the product of the animal's divinity. The bovine draft animal, the ox or the buffalo, was conceived of as a god, a Buddhist god, a bodhisattva, who descended from heaven for the express purpose of helping us cultivate the land. Yeah? So according to a wide range of ritual scriptures and as well as works of fiction, all of them tell us that the ox or the buffalo is a bodhisattva, a self-sacrificing bodhisattva. This is the definition of a bodhisattva, yes? A bodhisattva is a god who sacrifices itself. So the ox or the buffalo is a bodhisattva who sacrifices himself, descending to earth to help us, to help the peasant cultivate the land. So in a way, this legend is really a touching expression or a moving expression of the peasant's gratitude to his bovine companion. Yeah? They're working together in the fields. And the peasant is so grateful to the animal that he says, this animal is a god. He's a god that came from heaven to help me plow the land. In any event, because the animal is a god, eating its meat is not only thankless, it's not only ungrateful, it is blasphemous. It is a crime, it is a sin. You're not supposed to do it. Now, what I will suggest to you today, so I'm giving you now the conclusion. You can all go home right now. I'm telling you right now what I have to say. What I will try to argue today is that the divinity of the ox or the buffalo, the divinity of bovines, the divinity of the cattle, and the concomitant prohibition of their flesh was transmitted to China from India via the vehicle of the Buddhist faith. Yeah? In other words, the growing sanctity of the cattle in India of the 1st century CE influenced or was reflected in the Buddhist movement of India in the 1st century CE and was transmitted by Buddhism to China. In other words, the divinity of the Chinese ox is related to the sanctity of the Indian cow. Okay? So to phrase this again a little differently, what I'm aiming at, rather than a Chinese conception of cattle, the Chinese conception of this animal, it might be more useful to think of a Pan-Asian conception of bovine, Pan-Asian conception of cattle. Okay, is this clear? Okay. Here's my conclusion. Okay, as I said, you can read it. The divinity of the cattle, was transmitted to China from India by the vehicle of the Buddhist faith. Okay, now I have to mention previous scholarship, yes, I have to mention, and I'm not the first scholar, or the first Western scholar to be interested in the beef taboo. I first encountered the beef taboo. I first learned that there is such a thing as a beef taboo by Vincent Gossard's book, L'Interdit du bœuf en Chine. Yeah, Vincent Gossard, you're all familiar with his work. He's a great scholar, an excellent scholar, and a good friend. Now, Vincent is I hope you'll forgive me for saying it, I think he will. He's really a great scholar and a good friend, and he's an expert on Taoism, really of the late imperial period. And he studied the beef taboo as it appears in a genre called Shanshu, a genre of morality books that is heavily related, or intimately related to Taoism. These are late imperial, Ming and Qing period texts that are related to Taoism. And perhaps because of this, and because of other reasons that we can talk about, Vincent conceives of the beef taboo as a Chinese phenomenon that has nothing to do with Buddhism and nothing to do with external influences. Yeah, he interprets the beef taboo as in native Chinese terms. Yeah. And I first encountered the beef taboo in his book. But the more I was working and the more I delved into the materials that I will present, I'll try to share with you today, the more I became convinced that the origins of the beef taboo lie outside of China. That is my conclusion. Whereas he interprets the beef taboo in native Chinese terms, I interpret the beef taboo in cross-cultural terms. I see the beef taboo as an example of the Indian impact upon Chinese civilization, if you want. Yeah? That's how I see it. But I might be wrong. I hope not. I mean, we can talk about this. So anyway, let me show you, let us begin. And I begin with a god that some of you are familiar with, I'm sure. Some of you in the audience are familiar. A god called Niu Wang in Chinese, Niu Wang, the ox king. This god was among the most popular gods of rural China, late imperial rural China. The ox king, Niu Wang, there's another one called Ma Wang, okay? There's Ma Wang and there's Niu Wang. Niu Wang was the divine protector of bovine draft animals. That is the divine protector of oxen in the north and buffaloes in the south. The horse king, by the way, was the divine protector of horses, donkeys, and mules, of equal draft animals. But this is the ox king, and he protected his flock, his proteges, from the onslaught of episodic illness, from especially rinderpest. I don't know if you know anything about this dreaded disease. It was a terrible disease, rinderpest, it was a viral disease that killed the cattle across the world. They found immunization for it only in the 20th century. Now it's extinct, but it was a terrible disease, rinderpest. So the god was really important. The peasants all prayed for him to protect their flock, to protect their draft animals. Now, this god, Niu Wang, is referred to in a body of ritual scriptures from South China, and also in some other texts, is referred to not only as Niu Wang, ox king, but as the Niu Wang Da Li Pusa. That is the ox king, great strength bodhisattva. And this name already hints of the legend that I just told you, yes? That the god is actually incarnate. He is a bodhisattva who is incarnate in the very bodies of his proteges, of the cattle. So let me show you an example. This is a ritual text from rural South China. Yeah, for sure, Niu Wang, Miao Jing. We can talk later about these manuscripts. I've been working recently on manuscripts from rural villages in South China. And it's shall I tell? I already spoke about it. I've just mentioned very briefly, it's amazing. You can buy them online. The book vendors, you go into Kung Fu, the Jiushu Wang, yeah, the used bookstore, and you put in Niu Wang, and you'll find all sorts of, because no one uses these scriptures anymore, so booksellers buy them and sell them online. So it's unbelievable. You can buy 18th century or 19th century ritual texts from South China online. In any event, so here is this book. And again, I apologize for those of you who heard me talk about this. So what does it say? At that time, the bodhisattva of great strength, Dali Pusa, emerged from his seat. Pressing his palms in reverence, he addressed the Buddha saying, "World Honor One, I have made up my mind to become a Buddha. I have long seen the people of the mortal world struggling in the fields. With their 10 fingers they claw the mud until the blood flows. I pledge to be born in a buffalo body." I see that here I translated it as buffalo. I should say in parentheses, both buffalo and ox are referred to in Chinese by the same word, niao. Yeah, usually just niao. Sometimes they qualify it, so the ox is the huang niao, and the buffalo is the shui niao. But in most of the scriptures, they just write niao. So you don't know if it's a buffalo or ox. Yeah? I mention this because I think that the cult of this god and the prohibition of the meat, of its meat, were more prominent in South China. I think it's usually a buffalo that they had in mind, okay? But anyway, during the Navy period. But anyway, so here you see the legend. Yeah, the legend. The animal is a god. The animal is actually a pusa, the great strength of this. Huh? Now I continue, let us look at another stage, another passage. The Bodhisattva of great strength said, "I only worry that because of people's accumulated evil karma, they will prize my robust flesh and skin, they will slaughter me, peel off my skin, and consume my flesh. Hence they will be punished in hell. There is no possibility of redemption." In other words, In other words, this bodhisattva, he doesn't care that he will be eaten. Yeah? He's not worried about himself, but he is worried about the people who will eat it and then be punished in hell. Yeah? So here you see the connection. Because he is a god, those who eat his flesh or eats flesh will be punished in hell. Okay? So the Buddha reassures him. The Buddha tells him the story of Prince Sattva. You know this story, yes? Mm-hmm. The Buddha sacrificed his own flesh to 100 tigers. You know the story, yes? So it's a famous. So actually, in fact, it is the Buddha himself in his previous life that sacrificed his own flesh to a tiger. So in fact, he is comparing this bodhisattva to himself, to the Buddha. Yes. So anyway, this is the legend. So the animal is a god, and its flesh is forbidden, or eating its flesh is a sin. Now, this idea that I find of very prominent during the late imperial period in works of fiction and ritual scripture, especially from South China, this idea I can trace back to the medieval period, to Buddhist-oriented literature of the medieval period, okay? That's what I'm suggesting to you. I can trace it back. So I'll give you a few examples. I forgot to show you this. Do you mind? I apologize for the breaking the flow. Just one point. I said that the ox is a bodhisattva, is a god, a bodhisattva. Some texts, some scriptures specify that this bodhisattva is the most beloved of all Chinese bodhisattvas, namely Guanyin Pusa. So in fact, the ox is a bovine manifestation of one of the greatest of all bodhisattvas, Avalokiteshvara Guanyin. Because of this, in South China, usually the ox king is rendered as the female Guanyin mounted upon, this is South China, upon a buffalo. You see this? So this is in fact the Niowang Pusa. I will just say in parentheses, so this is the ox king, great strength bodhisattva, as rendered in South China, as a female goddess upon a buffalo. 3 years or so I went to Sichuan province, Chengdu, and I wanted to buy. Originally I wanted to visit the temples, but most of the temples are destroyed. Okay, most of the temples are destroyed. But in each and every antique store in Chengdu, they sell these statues, Qing Dynasty statues or Republican period statues, because this ox riding Guanyin was among the most popular gods in Sichuan province. So I bought one. I bought a statue. It's wonderful, from probably late Qing or early Republican period statue. Now, I'm telling you all of this why? Because you are familiar with the Indian god Shiva. Yes? Shiva has a bull, or sometimes he's shown mounted upon a bull, the bull Nandi. And I can show that this iconic image derived from the iconography of the Indian Shiva mounted upon a bull that was transmitted to China by Buddhism. Okay? I think so. I think that I will show this to you in a few minutes. Okay, now let us go back to the medieval period, or here we are in the 10th century. Okay, this is a text from the 10th century. He's talking about some peasant, it doesn't matter, and he says this. He particularly objected, that person, to the slaughter of cattle when he saw the heads and legs of oxen displayed in the village. He told his wife, what the people of this world are eating is all due to the labors of this yellow-furred bodhisattva. So what he's saying is that the ox that plows the field, he's clearly talking about an ox, not a buffalo. Yeah? Because it's yellow-furred. So what he's saying is the same legend I showed you, but this is the 10th century. The animal is actually a god, he's a bodhisattva. He's responsible for agricultural production. Nonetheless, in the end, people kill it. They better remember that heaven is not far off. So again, if you eat the flesh of this animal, you will be punished. It's a sin. You're all right? You're okay? I hope you're not. Okay, so now my next example is far better. Far better. Why? Because it's Imre Galambo's discovery. So, no, I'm sorry, here it is. This Imre discovered it on a Dunhuang manuscript. Nyo Shadali Pusa. This is written on a Dunhuang manuscript from the 10th century. What is really striking here is that it's an exact same name that I find 1,000 years later, yes, in the text I showed you. The great strength Bodhisattva. The ox is a great strength Bodhisattva. Dali Pusa. Yeah? And in fact, in between these texts in the 10th century and the text I just showed you, there are other examples, yeah, of this Dali Pusa. So in fact, yeah, we can sort of, in any event, we have here a late imperial phenomenon that we can trace back to Buddhist-oriented, Buddhist-related texts of the medieval period. Okay? Now, one more point, one additional point. The ox also figure, again, this is something I spoke about 2 years ago. The ox is a very common metaphor for Buddhahood in Chan literature, in the literature of the Zen school of Buddhism, of the Chan school. Okay? So, for example, there are hundreds of references. You run the Taoist canon, the Buddhist canon, and there are many, many references. So, for example, there is a Buddhist master and a student. The student asks, I'm in search of the Buddha, but I do not yet know how to continue my quest. So the master says, in general, it is as if one were looking for an ox on which one is riding. So, you know, this is the conundrum of looking for something that is innate in the searcher, yes? You're looking for Buddhahood, but in fact, the Buddha is within you. But the metaphor he uses is that of an ox. And now you might say that it's arbitrary. It might have been a horse. But the point is that this metaphor is repeated hundreds of times. Right? It's always an ox. It stands for Buddhahood. And then it penetrated also Chan-inspired art. You find that you're probably familiar with these paintings of ox herding, yes? That the parable of ox herding, that the process of the search for enlightenment is likened to, firstly, capturing an ox, and then taming the ox, and then riding the ox, and finally, the rider and the beast both disappear into nirvana, yes? And here the color of the animal changes. It was first black, but then when they sort of, it becomes enlightened, then it turns white, and finally, the ox, the rider and the animal disappear into a circle. The circle is also a symbol of Buddhahood, the graphic symbol of Buddhahood in Buddhism. And in some texts, you find the circle, and inside it the character Nyo. That's how they represent enlightenment or Buddhahood. So it's a circle and the ox. So again, so the spirituality of the ox, or the divinity ox, at least the spirituality, is very much evident in Chan Buddhism. Okay? So this is, so to recapture what I've been saying so far. So far I've traced the divinity of the animal, or tried to trace the divinity of the animal and the prohibition of its flesh, from the late imperial period to medieval Buddhism. Okay? Now let us move to the harder stage, from medieval Buddhism to India. Okay? What I will try to argue or suggest is that Buddhist literature, and that originated in India, Buddhist literature, and Buddhist art, and Buddhist ritual, all echoed the ox, all echoed bovines as significant or a special worth or even sanctity as distinct from other animal species. Yeah? That's what I'm trying to argue. That Buddhism really echoed sanctity or divinity to this animal. And I'm talking about Indian Buddhism that was transmitted to China. So there are many, 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 many examples. I will give you a few. And I start with one with which you are all familiar. And this is the parable from the Lotus Sutra. You all know this, yes? What is the Mahayana? You know the parable of the burning house, yeah? And there is a father, and the children have to get out of the house, and the superior vehicle for taking them out of the house, which the burning house, is the Mahayana, yes? And the Mahayana is an ox-drawn movement. They say it, yeah, explicitly, it's an ox-drawn movement. So, and you know this, yes? You know this parable. So the Mahayana is pulled by an ox. It is yoked to a white ox whose skin is pure white, whose bodily form is lovely, whose muscular strength is great, whose tread is even and fleet like the wind. This ox also has many attendants serving the garden. So again, the ox somehow figure prominently as a metaphor for the Mahayana. Now, if the Mahayana is an ox-drawn vehicle, then the Buddha himself is an ox. And in fact, the epithet of bull, or bull of a man, in Sanskrit, Vrishabha or Nara Vrishabha, is among the most common epithets of the Buddha. The Buddha is likened in Buddhist Sanskrit literature to a bull. Now, why a bull? Because the bull is a symbol of masculinity and royalty. Yeah, if you check the Mon, yeah, I know there are Sanskrit here, I'm sure. But when I read the Merriam-Williams dictionary, so the Merriam-Williams dictionary, I think, gives from this term Vrishabha, it gives from this bull or king or master of, yes, or a very manly person. So this is a common epithet of the Buddha. It is a bull. The point is that this term, the Sanskrit term, Vrishabha or Nara Vrishabha, was translated into Chinese as Niuwang. Niuwang. In the translation, why they added the wang? Because the bull in Sanskrit has the connotation of kingliness, of royalty. But in the Niu in China doesn't. So they translated it as Niuwang. So if you run the Buddhist canon, there are hundreds of references to Niuwang as an epithet of the Buddha. And this might be the source of the god Niuwang, about which I spoke earlier. In any event, it's clear, there are texts. It's clear that in later period, during the later period, there were Chinese authors who identified the Niuwang that protects the cattle with the Buddha Shakyamuni. They identified them. Why am I saying this? Because the texts say that Niuwang, who protects cattle, resides at the Jetavana garden. The Jetavana garden is the garden where the original Buddha Shakyamuni lectured or turned the wheel of the Dharma. You're with me? You follow me? For the first time. So again, there is a connection between the Buddha himself in Sanskrit literature to the ox king that protects the cattle in rural China. So this was my second example of bovines in Buddhist literature. My third example is more fun. I hope. Okay. Yeah. Please, I don't need to touch it. Enjoy. This is Amazon, India. This is Amazon, India, okay? Well, do I need to say anything? Yeah, well, the point is that because the cow is a divine animal, the bodily products of the cow, all of them, are sacred. Yeah, are sacred. This includes, of course, excrement or feces. Yes. So here we have bumbumbole, organic, holy, homemade. I don't know whether homemade, pure Indian desi cow dung cake for religious purpose. You can purchase this. Yes. You can go online and purchase this if you are so inclined. but yeah. Okay. Now the point is this. The point is that in India, in Hindu rituals, I'm not an expert, but in Hindu rituals, cow dung figures prominently. It is used for purification. Okay? Okay? And this is true to this day. True to this day. As you can see here. Now, Chinese monks were fully aware of this during the medieval period. Yeah, they all knew this. So, for example, Xuanzang, who went to India, in India the floor is purified by smearing it with cow dung. Or here you have Yixing, In the West, all the grazing cattle are herded into one shed. The ground is covered with layers of dung and urine. The Brahmins and common people alike consider it pure. Okay? So Chinese monks knew very well that in India, cow dung is pure, sacred, used for religious purposes. But the point is that they didn't have to go to India for this. A search of the Chinese canon, that is, the translated scriptures from Sanskrit, reveals some 800 references to cow dung. In fact, when you start looking, it's all over the place. Yeah? Because, why? Because, well, we can go into this, but especially in Tantric Buddhist rituals. You're familiar, yes? You know that there is Tantric Buddhism. I've been very interested in recent years by the impact of Tantric Buddhism on China. I'll say a word about this. Many gods, popular Chinese gods, actually are Indian gods that were transmitted to China by Tantric Buddhism. Because Tantric Buddhism is very close to Hinduism. I'm making very broad generalizations, okay? So, for example, Nirja, that I wrote a book about, was originally an Indian god, transmitted by Tantric Buddhism to China. The point is that not only the gods, the Indian gods, were transmitted to China by Tantric Buddhism, but also the rituals addressed to these gods. When you read the Chinese canon, you find hundreds of references to cow dung, because they translated the Indian texts. So it's all over the Chinese canon. I will give you just one example. This is from the Mahavairocana. This is the most central text of Tantric Buddhism in China and in Japan. So they say, Lord of the secret ones, having firmly trodden down the side at one, anyway, the master should smear it. They are talking about the preparation of the mandala, the sacred space. The master should smear it with clean cow's urine mixed with cow dung that has not fallen to the ground. Can you imagine? Yeah. There's a capture it apparently in mid-air, okay? So, what I'm saying is that, okay, you're okay? I'll give you, now, and it is used as medicine. The incredible thing is that it's also used as medicine, again, in Chinese Buddhist, in Chinese texts. Catherine Despo worked about a medical text from Dunhuang, so this is her translation. The point is that people consumed cow dung as medicine. Yeah? And we find it in Chinese texts that were translated from Indic languages. So, what I'm trying to say is that these texts obviously impressed upon the Chinese the sanctity of the animal that produced these products, okay? I think that this... By the way, it's curious, I was worrying about this. It's unfortunate, but in India, there were people using cow dung against COVID-19. You know this? They thought that this will help them, yeah? So, I'm not inventing this, yes? I read the essays of this. So anyway, so that's... Okay, my fourth example is a legend. I'm talking, giving you examples of cow or cattle in originally Indian Buddhism. Originally Indian, but translated. So the legend of Prince Golden Calf, I don't think it's very, I don't know if you've, I didn't know about it until recently. I don't know, do you know this legend? It's a very curious legend. The legend survives in a Chinese text that was discovered in Dunhuang, and is at the Beijing National Library. It was studied by Chinese scholars. I didn't study it myself, yes. I'm relying on secondary literature in Chinese. The legend, the text was written in Chinese around the year 600, it's relatively early, but scholars agree that it derives from a now lost Indian source, Sanskrit source. Yeah. And the legend goes as follows. It's very Indian, the legend, the context. There is a king, and the king has, a little bit like the Ramayana, the king has 3 wives, okay? The king had 3 wives. The senior, the elder 2 are not very nice, yeah? Not very virtuous. It is the young one who is the most virtuous and kind and inclined to Buddhism and all the good things. And she gives birth to a baby boy who is magnificent, and is of course the Buddha. He's the Buddha Shakyamuni, the future Buddha Shakyamuni. But the elder wives are jealous, so they take this child and feed it to a cow, to a very vicious cow. The cow eats the baby, and the cow then gives birth to a golden calf, a silver-hoofed and golden-horned calf. Yes, who is again, in fact, the Buddha Shakyamuni, this calf. Then the king really likes this calf. So again, the two elder wives are still very jealous and very angry and very full of hatred and spite. So they tell the king that they are sick, and what they need is they must eat beef. But not just any beef, they must eat this calf. That is the Buddha Shakyamuni, in fact. So the king is sort of, wishy-washy, he's kind of right, easily persuaded. So even though he loves the animal, he agrees. So the animal is brought to the butcher. But then the calf, of course, can talk. So the calf talks with the butcher and says, listen, spare my life, I will make you king. Okay? So the butcher spares the animals, the calf's life. He slaughters a dog instead. And then the calf roams somewhere, and there are many adventures, and he falls in love with a woman, and she falls in love with him, and they get married, and then he regains his gorgeous human form, and then he goes back and fights with his father. There are Oedipal tones, yes, in the story. He has a battle with his father, and then he becomes king, and when he's king, he rewards the butcher. He abdicates the throne in favor of the butcher. He himself goes into nirvana, and the butcher that refrained from killing the calf becomes king. So obviously, you can't get a better reward for sparing bovine lives, yes? Now, the funny thing about this story is, we have it in a Dunhuang manuscript dated, the text was written around 600. The legend was extremely popular in China all through the 20th century, in the Baojuan genre of oral literature. There are many, many dozens of manuscript copies of this legend from the late imperial period. So I think it's quite clear that the legend contributed to the spread of the beef taboo, as I see it. Okay, my fifth and perhaps last example comes from art. And what I suggest to you is that there are many Indian gods who ride bovines, either a buffalo or an ox. You know, of course, that the Indian gods are all recognizable sometimes by the vehicle, the animal vehicle they ride, yes? So here is, should be Yama. Yeah, Yama riding a buffalo, that is his animal. Yama again, from Dunhuang, 10th century, upon a buffalo. This is Yamantaka, the destroyer of death, riding, it should be an ox, I think, or a buffalo. Is it a buffalo? I'm not sure. Okay, and this is the one, the most important one is, of course, Shiva. Shiva is associated with bovine, with this animal, the bull Nandi. Here you think from Hotan, Central Asia, in a 6th century painting with the animal, the ox below him. And this is Nandi as an object of worship, Shiva's bull as an object of worship in India, in a current Hindu temple. Now the point is that this is Shiva mounted upon an ox. Shiva mounted upon an ox or a buffalo. Well, it should be an ox. Shiva mounted upon an ox. This it's not very clear perhaps. You see Shiva, right? This is Shiva. I'm not an expert on it, but it's identified by art historian as Shiva sitting upon an ox, upon his bull Nandi. And this is from the Dazu caves in Sichuan. You know the Dazu caves, cave statues in Sichuan. The point is, the buffalo riding guanyin. You remember that I showed you the buffalo riding guanyin? The earliest statue of the buffalo mounted guanyin was discovered at the Dazu caves, and it dates several decades later than this one. And it's essentially the same thing. The god is shown facing the viewer, and the animal in profile. The animal in profile to the right. So I think that this is the source. Oh, it's very likely. Yes, you see, this is the ox riding Guanyin, the buffalo riding Guanyin, and this is before that Shiva. Okay, I think that I'm approaching the. Yeah, I hope it's not too short. I hope it's okay. Okay, a few more points. Firstly, I've been trying to argue that Buddhism adopted the sanctity of the cow from the surrounding Indian culture, what we would nowadays call Hinduism, yes, from the surrounding Hindu culture. Chinese monks knew this. Chinese monks were fully aware of this. They knew that the sanctity of the cow was adopted by Buddhism from the surrounding Indian culture. And here you have it in the words of Dao Shi, the famed Buddhist author of the 7th century. Now, in his book, in his Fire and Jewelry, in this massive compendium, Dao Shi outlines rituals for rainmaking. And the rituals for rainmaking make use of cow dung. What I just told you, yeah? It makes use of cow dung. Now, Dao Shi has to explain this to his Chinese readers. Well, what does this mean? Why cow dung? Yes? So he explains, and this is his explanation. This is my translation. In the lands of the West, the ox plows the land, yielding the myriad foodstuffs. Therefore, the people commonly consider its excrement pure. Yeah? That's it. Yeah. They build temples where Brahma, Indra, and the cow are worshipped together. Now, here is the sentence. Buddhism followed this popular sentiment, likewise accepting cow dung as pure. Okay? So in fact, he's saying what I'm saying. What he's saying is Buddhism accepted the popular sentiment in India that the cow is sacred, and the cow dung is pure. Yeah? So that's what he's saying. Okay. So that's basically my argument. Now you might ask, rightly so, what about native agency? What about the Chinese? Am I arguing that the Chinese thus accepted the sanctity of the cow? Or well, there is native agency, and what I will suggest is this. I will suggest that the sanctity of the cattle was accepted by the Chinese and by Chinese officials, that's the point, because it perfectly suited the political ideology of the empire. What does it mean? Beginning in the first centuries, beginning in the Han Dynasty, in the first century CE, Chinese officials were always fearful lest the peasants lack beasts of burden. It was kind of like, how are we going to cultivate the land if we have no oxen or buffalo? Yeah, they were afraid that the army lacked horses and that the peasants lacked oxen or buffalo, Neo. Yeah? So, beginning in the Han Dynasty, there were occasionally government laws or they issued proclamations forbidding the slaughter of draft animals, of either horses or sometimes it's horses and cattle. Yeah. So, what I would suggest is that, from the perspective of these Chinese officials, the sanctity of the Indian cattle was if not God sent, it was probably Buddha sent. Yeah, it just fitted what they needed. Yeah? So that's why it was adopted. Already 150 years ago, the Dutch sinologist, de Groot, let me pronounce his name correctly, de Groot, he said that he noted the irony that the beef taboo was often enforced by Confucian officials who were who objected, who were the staunch enemies of Buddhism. Yeah? But the reason is that the sanctity of the cattle fitted exactly what they needed. They wanted they wanted to make sure that the peasants have draft animals. Okay, so that's why it was accepted in China, and the agency of the Chinese is also evident in the changes that they made to the Indian sanctity of the cattle, or the Indian taboo. So I will make 2 points before I conclude. Firstly, the Indian cult, if you want, is of a female goddess. In India, when they say that a cow is sacred, nowadays at least, Nowadays, when we think about India, we think about the sacred cow, not the sacred bull. Why? And it's related to milk. In this painting, for example, this is from the early 20th century. So you see the cow and all the gods of the Hindu pantheon within the body of the cow. And this is death that is not allowed. Yeah, it's not allowed to attack those who worship the cow. Yeah, and the cow, what does it give? The cow gives milk. The cow gives milk, and here are the principal citizens, the groups of the Indian population. There are Hindus, I don't remember how it works exactly. This is a British man, yeah? This is a British man. So there are the English, the Hindu, the Farsi, and the Muslims. They all feed upon the milk of the cow. So in India, it's really, at least as we know it today, it's a cult of a female goddess. In China, as I tried to show, even though this god is identified also with Guanyin, essentially we are talking about the great strength bodhisattva as a male, essentially. We are talking about a draft animal, not about a producer of milk. You follow me? It's a draft animal. And the Chinese, you know this, they didn't drink milk. So that's one difference. The second difference concerns, at least between what we know now in India and what I'm talking about in China, concerns the very species of the animal. In India, it's only the zebu cow. I'm sorry. In India, it's only the zebu, this bovine, that is being sacred. In India, the buffalo is not sacred. In China, the animal that benefited from the sanctity of the Indian cow is primarily the buffalo. You follow me? It's primarily the buffalo. And I think, now one reason is because buffalo and ox were both referred to by the same word, niao, yes? So the Sanskrit go, meaning cow, meaning cow, was in China. In Chinese translation, it encompassed also the buffaloes. Whereas there is a different Sanskrit word for a buffalo. Okay? But beyond these terminological incidents, I really think that the reason why the beef taboo took roots in China, it was because of the love of the rice farmer to his draft animal. That's how I see it. It's the, okay? Okay. So I will conclude with, I guess that was this slide, yeah? So I will perhaps read my, so we are in England, yes? We are in England. I'm in England. So I will quote a great English writer, very great English writer. You are all familiar with what George Orwell said, yes? Yes, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. So this is what I've been trying to say. I've been trying to say that in Buddhism, no matter what the dogma or the doctrine is, in fact, yeah, Buddhism accorded the cattle special significance as distinct from other animal species, reflecting the growing sanctity of the cattle in India of the 1st century CE. Buddhism transmitted it to China. The origins of the Chinese beef taboo lie in India. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Shahar. I'll just say a few words about our discussant before inviting him to the podium. So we're very lucky to have Dr. Gregory Scott with us today. He is a senior lecturer in Chinese culture and history and program director for Chinese studies at the University of Manchester. Dr. Scott is a scholar of late imperial modern Chinese history and culture with a particular interest in Chinese Buddhism, as well as in Chinese religions more broadly, as well as print culture, religious publishing, scriptures, and the Buddhist canon. And Dr. Scott's recent book, titled Building the Buddhist Revival, Reconstructing Monasteries in Modern China, explores how and why Buddhist sacred sites were rebuilt in China in the late 19th century and early 20th century, and how reconstruction provided religious communities with an opportunity for innovation. And his current book project, which I hope we'll get to talk about more later today, explores Buddhist print culture in Republican China. I'm very intrigued to hear more about this. So please, thank you.
Great. Thanks very much for the invitation, Dr. So hello everybody. This is quite a daunting task. I've read Professor Shahar's books since I was interested in Chinese religion, so to come up here and follow his act is it's not going to be easy. I, of course, have the privilege of having read 2 of the draft chapters that provide the material for this, and in those draft chapters he goes into a lot more detail, some really fascinating detail about the link between the figure of the Buddha and the ox, and it's sort of a lot more backstory and a lot more information behind the sorts of ideas that he's introduced today. Vincent is also one of my friends. I just saw him earlier this year in Paris, and I think it's a great contribution of yours to look at the basic story that he explored in his book from 2005, and to remind him that not everything is going to be Taoist or popular religious. I mean, Vincent, he tolerates Buddhism, but it's not really his focus at any time of the day. He allows us to sit at his table, but yeah, he's not all interested in Buddhism per se. So from my point of view, what this project brings is a really invaluable additional strand to the beef taboo, the taboo versus harming bovines but also eating their flesh, that especially seems to have become popular around this sort of late imperial period, early 20th century in China. So it's filling in a part of the story that if we were just to rely on Vincent's work and this kind of Taoist or popular religious point of view, we just wouldn't get. And from my point of view, the evidence that you've provided and the links that you have drawn show conclusively that there is a Buddhist strand in here, and there's the very important scriptural basis and inspiration from the religions of South Asia and from the sort of the roots of Mahayana Buddhism that has come into China and that's merged with other aspects to create this idea, right? To create this notion that there is something sacred about, something special about bovines. They should be protected. You should not eat their flesh. These sort of special animals, right? More equal than others or less equal than others, I suppose, more special than others. So I only have a few, I guess, questions to read. One major question, I suppose, and it's more requesting a little bit more detail and a little bit more information. Throughout all of this story, when I was reading your draft chapters as well, the one question that kept coming up into my mind is why is it only in the late imperial period that we see this really start to take root and take hold? If you're seeing the roots of it in 3rd century, 4th century sometimes in terms of the translated scriptures, and then the Buddhist monks when they're writing about the role of bovines in Buddhism, that's a little bit later in the medieval period, but it's really only in the late imperial period when we see all of these kind of strands come together in a very strong way. And I wonder if it is related to economic and social conditions that start to arise in China, maybe even especially in South China during the late imperial period, because for all of the sacredness that this Buddhist perspectives bring to the bovine, in virtually every case, the reason in China why they're special and protected is because they're productive. And you got there in the end of your talk as well, right? It's looking at it from the officials' point of view. They're worried that the farmers won't have these essential tools, right? These animal tools to help them do the plowing, do the harvesting, move things around in their farm and create food. And if I can just go back a couple slides earlier as well, even Dao Shi, right? This is in the 7th century, even he, when he's trying to explain to his fellow Buddhists, what is it about bovines that makes them special? What is it that sets them apart from other animals, right? I mean, we're Buddhists, we don't like to harm or like to kill, but somehow these particular animals are different. Even he focuses on their utility, the fact that they do work and that they produce. So these two ideas of utility and production, I think, really need to be, it would be great if you could explore them a little bit more from different perspectives. From a Buddhist perspective, as understanding why bovines are different. From an official perspective, as you say, when we get into the late imperial period, the Chinese population is booming, there's no more land to be cultivated, people are really worried about starvation, about hardship. I have to imagine from officials' point of view, they really might want to play this up and try to encourage people not to kill oxen, to protect buffalo, to protect oxen. From their point of view, because of their utility and their production. These things have kind of merged together with the sacrality, right, coming from South Asia through Central Asia, with this very kind of hard-nosed idea that this is an animal machine that we need to produce food. And in that same kind of idea, and in that same kind of realm, it might be worthwhile to look at, you mentioned Baozhen, you mentioned Shanshu, which Vincent looks at in his book. It might be worthwhile to look at these kind of moralizing literatures that really started to boom in sort of the late 19th, early 20th centuries of literati trying to write in an accessible way and convince people to do moral things, either through threatening them with divine punishment if they do wrong, or promising all kinds of rewards and good fortune if they do the right things. And I have to imagine that in many of these baozhuan, they were written by very literate writers, sort of writing for a very broad, very large audience. And in their minds, they may be thinking, I really want to play up this sacrality, this specialness of the oxen, because I don't want these stupid peasants to be killing and eating their oxen. If everybody did this, there'll be no machines, animal machines, right, left to do the plowing, and there'll be starvation and hardship as well. So I was really glad that you got there at the end of the talk, right, looking at it from a sort of a non-sacred, a non-religious point of view, from a very simple economic production point of view. This is a thing that we need to live and to protect life. And if you take a look at this moralizing literature in Chinese from this period, sort of late Qing, even into the Republican period, a lot of it is about trying to convince people that it is moral and right to protect life. Whether it is collecting single pieces of grain that have gone unnoticed and to sort of this idea of cherishing grains, whether it's protecting young children, anti-infanticide, trying to stop people from destroying life and trying to preserve life in all of its forms. When you're describing the beef taboo and this sort of sacrality of oxen during this late imperial period, these are the other sort of genres of text that kept popping into my mind, right? These endless screeds, these endless books that are published by literati trying to convince people to do the right thing, to protect life, not to harm the tools and harm the means by which everyone needs to continue to survive and to continue to live. So, yeah, I think if you took a look at some examples of Baozhuan and Shanshu from this period, the same writers and the same people who are in one breath are saying, don't slaughter oxen, they're special, they're sacred, are probably also going to be talking about things like cherishing grains, anti-infanticide, all of this kind of life-promoting, life-sustaining, moral teachings and moral instructions. So yeah, that was the main question, I suppose. It's more of a time question and a context question. Throughout all of this long history, why is it only in the late imperial period when we see all of these threads start to come together? But I feel like your argument is that there is a strong Buddhist thread within this, and I'm absolutely convinced. It's wonderful you kind of unearthed this, showed us what has always been there, right? This Buddhist influence on this phenomenon. But I'm left wondering, what's the kind of the historical context for this? Why is it in this period when all these things kind of come together? Is it related to what is going on in China more generally? Is it just a matter of time for these sort of cross influences to start to talk to each other more closely? Or is it maybe something else as well? Okay, so that's sort of my one main question with a lot of smaller questions around it, but basically, and again, having read the 2 draft chapters, I was really pleased to see all of this come together in such a way. So, all right, thanks.
Thank you.
That's all. I don't know if you want to say something to that, and then we can get to the Q&A.
Yeah, so thank you very much. So I will divide my answer into 2. Firstly, thank you very much. So let me begin with the literature of life protection. So you will send it to me, yes?
Sure. Yeah.
So I'm not an expert on this, and yes, I would love to read more. Thank you. Regarding the time period, I should clarify. I said late imperial as I talked because these were the materials that I worked on. These were the ritual scriptures that I was working on. But in fact, I agree with Vincent. Vincent argues that the beef taboo becomes popular in the song. That's his point in his book. It becomes popular in the song and from the song onwards. As I see it, he doesn't mention it, as I see it, it's related, again, I mentioned, you know how it is, but I shouldn't say this, but I mean, you know how it is when you write a book or when you write something and you do all this research and only after you finish, when you go to you go back to write the introduction, you suddenly realize, the picture becomes clear after you've done. Sometimes I tell my students, first write the chapters, then write the introduction, yes? Because only after you write it, you go back. So only after I wrote it, as I wrote it, I became more and more convinced that the animal in China, that was the focus was the buffalo. That's how I see it. It was the buffalo, not the ox. That's my impression. It was usually most of the scriptures in question, most of these anecdotes, most come from South China, most. So I see it also as related to the song, to the Tang-Song transition. As I see, there are two things here that came together. One was the impact of Buddhism, long-term impact of Buddhism. The other was the gradual transformation, the transition of the heartland of the empire from north to south and from wheat to rice. As I see it, it's related to the growing. So it's not the late imperial, even though the talk I always said late imperial. I said it because these were the ritual scriptures with which I began. But it's actually the song. It's actually the song onwards, probably. From the song, it's very popular, and I relate it to rice, to the buffer, to the discovery. It's very interesting because we have. I was working a little bit on agricultural literature, on non-shu, this genre, and in the song, after the move of the court to Hangzhou, you getting this non-shu with such admiration for the buffalo. Again, it's sometimes unclear because they write no, but it's clear they're writing about rice. Yeah, so I relate it to the enormous significance of the buffalo. As that's how I see it. But yeah, that's what I can say. But again, thank you very much. Again, the literature that you are mentioning of the 19th, 20th century is something that I should look at. So,
Oh, of course, I'd be happy to.
so thank you.
Thank
I
you.
don't know what we are.
So, would you like to do the Q&A? I mean,
Sure,
choose
yeah,
questions.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if any, yeah.
Yeah, so let's open up the floor for questions.
So please, I don't know the names. That's the problem. I can't do it because I don't know the person at the very back.
That's
Yeah.
What happens when a buffalo dies?
So they are supposed to make. My answer is not going to be. They do a ritual for the salvation of its soul, and in fact, the ritual is done already during the animal's life. Some of the scriptures that I read from South China, they outline, they are very concerned with sins, both the sins that they, okay, I didn't talk about this, but it's forbidden to eat buffalo or ox meat, okay, again, we have the cardinal, for two reasons. One reason is because it's a god. That was my talk today. But there is another reason. Because the animal is actually a human being. And you find the two arguments made together in the same scriptures. The animal is a human being who is being punished, usually for the crime of beef eating by bovine rebirth. Yeah? We have stories that a person is about to slaughter an ox and then he looks, oh, this is actually my dad. And someone recognizes it. They recognize the animal. So this is the other argument. So there are rituals for absolving the animal of the sin it committed in its previous life, so that the animal will be reborn in heaven. Actually, already in Dunhuang, there are, I think Stefan Kaiser even translates some of them, there are texts for the salvation of the gangnyo, the salvation of the soul of the animal. So, yeah. And then the ritual texts are also very much concerned. It's very nice. The texts are really nice in terms of animal protection. People ask the animal forgiveness for mistreating it. There is always the fear that the animal in the afterlife, either because they just feel bad, or because they are afraid that the animal will sue them in hell for its mistreatment. So they ask forgiveness from the animal, asking that it forgives them, and also praying for the redemption of the animal, the sins that the animal committed. Both things. And I will say something else. Again, I'm sorry to go on and on. Something else. Again, I became aware of it very late. In fact, again, the love of the buffalo is not something unique to China. You find it all in all the rice cultures of Southeast Asia, Burma, Thailand, Vietnam. Similar rituals for the salvation of buffalo soul were conducted in Vietnam and in Laos and in Burma and and there is French scholarship on this. That's what I read. I don't know the native languages. French scholars from the Indo-Chinese Empire who wrote about this. Please, yeah.
To follow up on Dr. Scott's comment, I have another question. Because he's asking about the political and the historical perspectives, maybe, and a little bit of culture. I wonder whether or not environmental perspectives could be considered in this sort of situation. Because sometime I heard that cows and water buffaloes, they're not just very effective and productive animal machines, but they're also very expensive, right?
Yes.
They consume lots and lots of energy, right? You have to use up the resources to raise them. And if you look at China or India, these are very much resource poor countries. So in other words, do you think that in terms of population size, in terms of the energy, the environmental resources that these civilizational countries could have, right? Could they sustain a large population that eats beef?
Yeah, you're of course right. This is the in the broadest, if you read the broadest, again, you understand, I'm telling all of you, I'm confessing, yes? I come from the field of religious studies, yeah, Chinese religion, and when I was writing this book that Gregory read 2 chapters of, I found myself going into the field of agriculture, yes? Which is not my original expertise in any way. So when you read the general histories of Chinese agriculture, that's what they always say, that in China population pressure meant that that's why the Chinese didn't breed animals for meat, yeah, because there was no grazing. It's a waste in China to have grazing land when you have so many people, and it's certainly true. I mean, to an extent, it's certainly true to an extent. Yeah. In North China, it's very clear, I wrote about this, I wrote an essay about this. In North China, during the late imperial period, there were hardly any horses, because horses need a lot of food and a lot of care. And the Chinese peasants, they couldn't afford having horses. So the principal draft animal in North China was actually the donkey, because the donkey can survive on much less food. In South China, regarding the buffalo, again, I'm relying on secondary literature. The buffalo is apparently a unique animal because, first of all, it lives very long. The buffalo the buffalo can work sometimes up to 30 years, but certainly it's over 20. So a Chinese peasant, and usually the animal itself was expensive. The buffalo itself, it was expensive to have a buffalo, to buy a buffalo. So most peasant families, they owned at most one buffalo. And this buffalo worked with the same owner, sometimes for decades. He might have grown with it from his childhood, and grown with the same animal. So there was real affection between the farmer and the buffalo. Yeah, that's why I'm always emphasizing here in this talk that the buffalo, yes, the connection to the buffalo. But anyway, thank you. Yeah. Yes, I apologize again, even though you told me your name.
Thank you, Professor, for the talk. My question is actually, I actually have 2 questions. So you try to explain why beef taboo was prominent, particularly in southern China, and your argument is because of this, because ox was considered a god, it's divine. And I have a different side. I want to offer this perspective that, since I'm an early medievalist, so my knowledge is only confined to that period. So basically, in the early medieval period, which is before the Tang, we know that Buddhists was not always vegetarian, so they could eat meat. So as long as the meat is considered pure. So there's this idea of this sanjing rou, so as long as the meat was prepared in a certain way and is considered pure, so the Buddhist, even monk, can consume it. And then it was in the 5th and 6th century, and then there was this emperor called Emperor Wu of Liang Wudi. He was the one who was particularly concerned about Buddhists eating meat. So he wrote this very famous piece of work called 断酒肉文. So the writing on banning alcohol and meat, and then he just tried to forbid, especially the Buddhists, eat from consuming meat. And then that became somehow, when Buddhists were trying to come, the Chinese Buddhists, when they try to attribute this like vegetarian tradition, they usually attribute this change to Liang Wu Di. So I was just wondering whether you have considered that. And also, then concerning beef particularly, I was just wondering, because there's also, in the Buddhist tradition, there's also, not only the Liu Jie, but also Gou Jie and Lu Jie. So like eating dog meat or like deer meat is also considered as something very terrible. So since you're only mentioning ox, so I was just wondering whether you also looked into the dog and the deer.
So thank you. First of all, I just say I will sort of use your question. I won't answer it exactly. You know what is politics about, yeah? If I were a politician, I would be more blunt. You ask a politician knows what he wants to say, yes, regardless of the question is being asked. The question is just an excuse to say what he wants to say. There's nothing. No, but anyway, regarding, so I won't answer you exactly. I'll just say in passing. First of all, I think that the thing about, I'm sorry to mention his name again. I'm indebted to his book, to Vincent's book. His assumption is, his assumption is that Buddhism promotes vegetarianism, okay? That is not eating any meat. And therefore, Buddhism has nothing to do with the beef taboo, because the beef taboo concerns only one animal. So this is something Chinese, that is not, you follow? But the point is that, as you said just now, Buddhism, when it came to China, it did not promote vegetarianism. There were Buddhist scriptures that promoted vegetarianism, but Buddhism was never unanimous on Buddhists were never unanimous about the appropriate time. And in fact, in Southeast Asia, for example in Burma, Buddhist monks do eat meat, but don't eat beef. You see, I find my appropriate examples in Southeast Asia. Yeah? So this is not exactly answering you, but this is regarding this question. Regarding the dog, yeah, you're right. Actually, Vincent wrote about it. And he attributes the prohibition of dog meat to Taoism, to Taoist texts. And he might be right. I didn't find it in the text I was working on, in the Buddhist-oriented text I was working on. For example, in the legend I just mentioned of the Buddha Shakyamuni being reborn as a calf, so the virtuous butcher substitutes a dog for the calf, and that's okay. So, yeah, but anyway. So I think, please, yes,
thank you for the super fascinating talk. Coincidentally, I'm also looking at social perceptions of animals in latent fear of China. And so in contrast to a more Taoist perspective, you can see lots of Zididov and also your work on Buddhism. I'll try to look at more from a secular, vernacular perspective as seen by the locals. For example, I look at local gazetteers in Zhejiang, look at literati writing, and it seems that, in particular, animals are very much like perceptions of animal filth, and the sort of excreta they produce are deeply interconnected with social perceptions during times like epidemics, because that's also, the kind of filth, the excreta produced by animals contribute to environmental pollution. Environmental pollution was associated in turn with disease and pollution. And you could also argue that, as I was looking at local gazetteers, that eating cow meat was inherently, especially diseased cow meat, was inherently polluting because, for example, it could transgress certain boundaries between human and animals, between the poisonous and the healthy. So in this sense, from what I can see, is that poisonous meat or animal excreta, cow dung, are seen more as polluting, but here you're suggesting that it could also be seen as pure. So how can we view this sort of apparently contradictory, paradoxical perceptions of animal filth as both pure and polluting?
You're right, and in fact, you're right, and you sort of caught me here. If I want to be more accurate, I try to show that, I said that Buddhist scriptures that were translated into Chinese during the medieval period argue, or promote the purity of cow dung as a reflection of the animal's divinity. And as such, they contributed in some way to the Chinese perception of the uniqueness of cattle or the inviolability of the cattle. That's one thing. But the truth is that the Chinese themselves didn't use much cow dung in their rituals. They didn't buy into this in practice. In practice, Chinese Buddhist monks did not use cow dung. Did not, in practice. And there is even, I found even one funny passage that I quote in one of my chapters. There is this Song period Vinaya master, and he's concerned about this because he reads the Vinaya regulations, not only tantric literature, but also Vinaya, monastic regulation, prescribe cow dung for cleaning the monastery, things like that. So, so he's trying to explain why we, the Chinese, we don't use cow dung. And he says, well, in India, the cows, they eat very pure grasses. So the cow dung is very fragrant. And here in China, it's not like that. So that's why we are allowed not to use cow dung. So that's what comes to my mind as an answer to your... Please, yes.
Thank you very much. I have a sort of a question/comment. It seems to me that both you and Vincent are very much concerned with the origin question. Where does this taboo come from?
Yeah.
Is it Taoist or is it Buddhist? And obviously, all the materials you bring together clearly show that there are connections, and of course in Vincent's book, there's all the materials there as well. Might one want to sort of take the question in a different way? In other words, if one was to assume that economic motives are very important behind taboos, in other words, you taboo resources because they are very valuable. If you see a mountain that has particular resources, you turn it into a sacred mountain and you forbid people from accessing it. If you look at the earliest sort of calendars, day books, pre-Buddhist, even pre-institutional Taoist, there are days in which are good for handling cattle, days in which you shouldn't handle cattle or other domestic animals, so to speak. So what seems to me to be the more important question is, why are things tabooed and what are the motives behind it? And then, secondly, is it only a dietary taboo we're talking about? You give the example of dung, and of course, I would assume that in late imperial China, cow dung, was valuable, right, on the fields as well. And I assume that when cattle die, from illness or from, other sorts of reasons, that there are prescriptions as to what you should be doing with the hides, with the horns, with certain bodily parts, that show up in medicine. In other words, there is usage of animal parts, including those of cattle parts. That's ongoing at the same time as you have all these sort of taboos. And so my question is, should we break down that notion of a taboo a little bit more carefully, and not simply say it's a dietary taboo or it's a religious taboo, but in other words, it's the motives behind the taboos.
Yeah.
And they're multiple. I mean, I can imagine that there are multiple origins for, a beef taboo.
Yeah. Thank you. How should I answer your question? Here I completely agree with Vincent. He points out that the officials that forbade the slaughter of draft animal, of oxen or buffaloes, always permitted the consumption of an animal that died a natural death. This was, by the way, the excuse under which such meat was actually sold on the market during the Qing dynasty. They said, well, the butcher will tell you, this animal was not slaughtered, he died a natural death, so that's okay. By contrast, the religious taboo, it was a sin to eat the animal no matter how the animal died. No matter how the animal died. So that's what the scriptures I've been working on are saying. No matter how the animal died, it's a sin to eat it or use its bodily parts. Here the difference between now, I will again And the difference with the donkey, by the way, is striking. In North China, donkeys were eaten. Anyone who works in North China, like I had them there, knows it. In North China, they not only rely on the donkey as the principal draft animal, but they also eat donkey meat. First, the donkey works for 20 years, then the poor animal, no one says that it's a god, yes? And then after it dies, my mother also very much cares for donkeys, so I inherited this. So, this poor animal, no one says that it's a god, that the donkey dies, then the owner sells it, it doesn't slaughter it itself, sells it to the butcher, then they butcher the animal, they eat its flesh, they use its hide, they use its internal organs for medicine. No part of the animal is left unused, in the case of donkey. Now, this is not exactly an answer to, it's not an answer exactly, but I will mention that, I'm talking beef taboo, beef taboo, beef taboo. I was working on, I visited the town of, where they have the salt wells in Sichuan. What's the name of this town? Ma?
and
Yeah, in England there is a, I apologize. There is this town in Sichuan that is very famous. It's one of the first places on earth in which they dug brine wells and they took out the salt from thousands of feet down. Okay, and there were buffalo. They used buffaloes as draft animals. This is an industrial setting, so you would have a mill and thousands of working buffaloes. And there the animal worked, was butchered and was eaten. So I see the difference as the difference between an industrial setting, in which, as we all know, there is an alienation between the owner and the animal, and a peasant-oriented and a peasant situation in which, in South China, there is really a rapport or a connection developing between the peasant and the single animal that it owns, that he owns. So I think that this is not exactly an answer, but I see a difference there.
Yeah, but that makes it actually very interesting, right? Because if you go back to earlier times, and even medieval time, I mean, the ox was owned by the state, right? Most peasants didn't own, oxen, and in a sense, this is about the power of the state. If the state can taboo the use, or if the state can taboo, the demise of the oxen, then obviously serves the power of the state.
Yeah, the peasant owned oxen during the medieval period in North China.
But the ownership of oxen of itself, would be fairly minimal, right? At least in the sort of the early medieval period, late Han period. I mean, these animals were usually owned by either landowners, people who ran large estates, and it is obviously in the interest of people who obviously run these estates that their resources, their tools, i.e. oxen, are being quote unquote tabooed, because they're valuable.
I don't know. Yeah, there is a difference. Yes, during all through the Tang period, again, I'm not exactly answering, but I'm thinking, all through the Tang period, there were estates in North China in which cattle was bred to be eaten. There were large farms in which cattle was bred to be eaten. You also see, by the way, in the earlier period, on the bricks, the famous bricks you see paintings of cattle being slaughtered to be eaten. But again, the change seemed to be the Song. From the Song on, I associate it with the South, also with the South China and the buffalo. But the origins are earlier. For example, the Dunhuan peasant who prays for the salvation of the soul of his ox. We have the document. Yeah, I apologize. Yeah, thank you. So first, the gentleman. Yeah,
I've eaten buffalo.
Maybe someone can tell us years.
In China, but not in a Chinese context. It was on the border of Laos, and it was up the hills with Hani people. And I think that slaughtering a buffalo is an important part of the local society amongst several non-Han peoples in that area. And I wonder to what extent, when you see Han Chinese moving south in the south, not slaughtering buffaloes is a way of asserting a Han Chinese identity. We don't kill our buffaloes. I've also seen in Eberhard or somewhere that these hill people were encouraged to slaughter buffaloes because it meant they weren't slaughtering human beings.
Yeah, that's wonderful. These are wonderful comments. Wonderful comments. Again, you see that the topic is complicated, huh? But I'll make two comments on this. And this is very important. First of all, I mentioned a great scholar, David Holm. You know the name?
Yeah.
David Holm. He has a book, Killing the Buffalo for the Ancestors.
Yeah.
He's a fantastic scholar, a great scholar. Among the Thai people that attach sanctity and significance to the buffalo, just like the Chinese, there is one major difference, namely that they sacrifice buffaloes on major occasions. They sacrifice it to the god. I don't know, the buffalo you ate was eaten as part of a sacrifice, or
it was a part of the spring festival. It was rerun for my benefit.
Yeah.
And it was amongst the Hani, who are actually Christians now, but I think they do that to distinguish themselves again from the Han Chinese.
Yeah. So what he shows, and you know, all sacrifice. Yeah. Wow. Let me mention my heritage. Yeah. Where I come from, the land of Israel. Yes. Where Abraham sacrificed, what was it, a ram instead of his son. Yeah. All sacrifice is substitute for human sacrifice.
Yeah.
All sacrifice. Yeah. Is substitute for human sacrifice. In the case of the minorities that David Holmes studied, this is absolutely clear.
Yeah.
They have legends that, they have a legend that, what was it, that people ate the bodies of the deceased. When someone died, people would eat that person, but then they substitute for that eating a buffalo when a person dies.
Mm-hmm.
They have many, but anyway, you're right, they make this connection, and you're right. I write about this in the book, I mentioned this. I think that the reason why the Chinese in South China did not slaughter buffaloes in sacrifice, and during the sacrifice, of course, you also eat it, the sacrificed animal, is A, because they adopted the beef taboo and applied it to the buffaloes, and B, because, and this is native Chinese, because Chinese ritual scriptures already from the Han period and earlier said that only the emperor or only the king is allowed to sacrifice a meal. So in fact, when the local people, the native people in South China were sacrificing buffalo, this was lèse majesté. This was an offense against Chinese political authority. Because in Chinese thinking, only the emperor is allowed to sacrifice. Yeah, of course, Roland knows this better than me. Yeah. I'm sorry, yes.
I thank you for showing some wonderful artifacts, especially from Sichuan. I work on Sichuan, so it's music to my ear, and indeed to know that how special it is. I am intrigued by the examples you gave, in the sense that I was wondering whether you have considered the transmission route or influence of, for example, the sculpture that you showed us, the Bodhisattva seated on the ox, and you've linked it to Hindu goddess. So if you find it in Sichuan, what, in your opinion, what is the likely transmission route?
Is it from the south or south?
Well, my sort of thinking is actually the influence from Southeast Asia, rather than India directly. And the same thing with all the artifacts that you find in South China.
Yeah.
You know, and once when you start looking at that transmission route, then there's another link to your belt saying, okay, so where is this influence coming from? And sorry, can I correct myself? The salt city is called Zipong.
Yes.
Just for
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, you're right, of course. Of course, I'm not an expert on this, but you know that there is this whole issue, for example, in Yunnan, yes, Yunnan Buddhism. Is Yunnan Buddhism influenced by, from Southeast Asia, or is it, and I'm not an expert, I don't dare say, but but the short answer is that I can't answer. But my good friend Hong Chong, who is, teaches at Shanghai Shifan Daxue and is a wonderful expert on Yunnan. So he was working, for example, on Yunnan Tantric Buddhism, Yunnan Tantric texts, and again, we all sort of hope that it comes directly from Southeast Asia. It's sort of a charming idea that it comes from Southeast Asia, but he showed conclusively that it comes from the north, so that is via the Silk Road,
From Central Asia.
from Central Asia to the Chinese capital and down to Yunnan. In the case of local tantric influenced Buddhist scriptures. But this is not to deny other possibilities. I can't answer. So thank you. Sure. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Shahar. So first, so before say what I want to say, I need to. So in the case of the Taoist studies, how we saw history before Tang, we are like a Buddhist taboo. So we can't say who is first, as if it's Buddhist or Taoist, in 6th dynasty period. So that is a joke. We just say for the Taoist studies. So we think it's about the religious studies. It's the same time. So in how we see the precept. So Buddhist and Taoist precept in the 4th and 5th century. So we have different cases, and we have the precept. So they are against the blood sacrifice.
Against
blood sacrifice.
Blood sacrifice.
The blood sacrifice. And we know for the blood sacrifice, so the top of sacrifice, it's a ox sacrifice. So in opposite, in Taoist and Buddhist case, it's really bad to sacrifice ox, and after the sacrifice, eat ox. Do you understand what I mean?
I'm not sure, I apologize.
So what I mean is, so they can't make blood sacrifice, and the most important sacrifice is about ox. So
yeah,
Allah.
I see.
And after the sacrifice, they are like a banquier, and they are costumed for the to eat meat. So the most important is to not make the top of sacrifice of ox sacrifice, and it's not possible to eat beef.
I see. So what you are actually correcting me, or what you are suggesting, is that the Taoist prohibition or Buddhist prohibition of blood sacrifice in general,
yes,
also contributed to the prohibition of beef slaughter in particular.
Yes,
yeah,
because it's the most important for the sacrifice.
Yeah.
So that is one case, and the other one in the same period we have a lot of prohibition about the relationship between men and the 6 domestic animals. So it's not just ox, but it's with all of domestic animals, and there are a lot of prohibition about the relationship.
But not about their slaughter necessarily. For example, the chicken, you can eat it, or the pig.
No, you can eat, you can fight. You can see if they are sex, if the animals have sex together. So there are a lot of taboo about the 6 domestic animals.
Yeah, I would be grateful if you yeah.
So my question is, can we see for the beef taboo, maybe it's like a cross with different origin. It's not just one origin, it's from Indian Buddhism, but maybe it's from Han Dynasty or 6th Dynasty Chinese religion. So it's possible it's Buddhism or Taoism. And this cross, it's about, so from Song Dynasty, it's more like common religious practice with different origins. So that's my...
I think I will have eventually to accept what you say. So there are multiple origins, yes. I will not, yeah. My talk was, yeah, I will... But I will be grateful if you forward to me the taboos on the 6 animals. Okay. And the period in which they arrived, it emerged. If you send me materials on this, I'd be grateful. Okay. Wow.
Maybe 2 more questions because we're slightly at
2 more questions.
Yeah, 2 more questions.
So the gentleman sitting next to Imri.
It's not the worst thing ever.
That's oh, I can say all the names I know. Sitting in front of Adam and next to Imri.
No, thank you. That was really interesting. Yeah, my name is Dan. Yeah, I'm more interested in North China. So I guess I'm curious, if you kind of reframe the story away from a kind of bovine taboo that's really centered in the South. Curious to what extent we wind up, how we understand the sort of regional difference that you've kind of described for us. Does it create really stark differences, do you think, in terms of religious practice, cuisine, or is it something that's easily bridged because of the circulation, say, of officials across the empire? If you've got an official from the north who's coming to the south, and the people there, aren't eating beef, how legible is that to him? And likewise, there are lots of officials from the south who end up coming to the north. They see the people there are eating lots of beef. Do they react with kind of horror and disgust of these backwards northerners? And also thinking about the Jurchen rule of North China. Does that have a contributing effect, do you think, kind of in this long Tongzong transition, you might call it, to kind of checking the spread of the taboo northwards? Or is it, I guess, how absolute is that sense of difference, and kind of what sorts of complications and senses of distinctive regional identities does that create?
You know what is, I always tell my students, what is the definition of a good question? The speaker can't answer through many of the questions that I just received. But I will just say, look, I try to say that during the late imperial period, again, unfortunately I go back to the late imperial period, it is my impression, but actually also Vincent's impression, that most of our scriptures that propagated taboo were written in South China. And the scriptures that I worked on were originated in South China. And it's not only the religious scriptures, there is a love of a buffalo that, for example, in Buddhist art, you see all of these paintings of the toddler sitting on the buffalo. These paintings. It's from the Song Dynasty. It really, when the court moves to the south, you get these court painters painting a toddler sitting on the buffalo, and this goes all the way to Li Keran in the 20th century. It's a favorite topic of his, the child on the buffalo. So it seems to me that during the late imperial, that's why I was saying that during the late imperial it's in the south. Also, but this is not much, when I visited villages in North China and places where they have ox temples in North China, at least one a big one in Shanxi, and I asked them, do you eat beef? Did your ancestors eat beef? They always say, yeah, we eat beef, no problem. And they worship the ox king. So that's why I said that during the late imperial period, it's my impression that it's more in the south, and I tied to the love of the buffalo. However, our earliest evidence comes from the north. For example, from Dunhuang, what Imre discovered in Dunhuang, all the passage I showed you where the peasant says that the ox is that the animal is a huang mao, a pusa, so it's clearly he's talking about an ox, not about a buffalo. And Buddhism came to China from the north, actually, to strengthen my case. So it's so that's all I can say. Now, how did officials? Now, the taboo was spread by religious scriptures, and a different issue is that there are the government officials who also, to a certain extent, enforce it or enforce. It's not clear. But again, here I can't answer. But clearly there were places where they did not enforce it. Clearly, for example, the town of Zhejiang, they didn't enforce it. And to this day, Zhejiang is famous for its beef dishes. For its, that's all I can say. One last question, yes? One last question, please.
I think if I remember Vincent correctly, he also said that despite the promulgation of legal codes, prohibitions, it's actually very rarely enforced in South China in the late imperial periods, which actually leads me to a question of why...
I'm sorry, can you repeat the first sentence?
Just pointing to what you said, that Vincent in his book did say that legal promulgations of beef taboo was very rarely enforced. And my question is, why is it so rarely enforced, and despite all the official rhetoric? And also, that's also related to this rampant private slaughter, which led to a lot of rinderpass and all of that. And you can see both Chinese and even British accounts later on saying that you see all these locals going to buy at market, very foul-smelling meat. They continue to consume that despite all these prohibitions around it, rhetorics against it. Why do they continue to consume that? I'm just been trying to figure this out myself.
Yeah, so again, I'm not an expert on this. You know, there is I quote in my book, a missionary, is it Doolittle that I'm quoting? I don't remember, I think it's Doolittle, who lived in Fuzhou, I think, and he says, well, the officials will, again, when we are talking about a religious sin, it's a question, there is the religious sin, and there are the peasants in South China who perhaps are fearful of it and observe it and do not eat buffalo, and there is the state prohibition of an animal that died, that was slaughtered. But so what Doolittle says is, the reason, he actually answers your question. And he says, well, he says two things. He says the butchers bribe the officials. That's one thing that he says. And the second thing he says is that because they claim that the animal died a natural death, but everyone knows that this is not the case, something like that. So that's what he says about Fuzhou. I can send you the passage. He goes into it. But I'd be grateful if you share with me some of the materials that you're working on about the...
Yeah, likewise, I'd love to learn about your research. Thank you.
So thank you.
Okay, so I think we should probably conclude here because we're slightly over time. So thank you very much everyone for coming, and thank you.